I found her there, in the golden gloom of a restaurant that was once ours, sitting by candlelight that seemed to mock what I once called home. Her eyes widened as soon as she saw me standing in the doorway, as if I were a materialized shadow of the lies she was hiding. She didn't understand how I knew. She didn't even try to explain. She was petrified, with the fork suspended in the air and the smile dying on her lips. I, however, had already made up my mind, that night would be the end. The end of a story that, until then, I swore would be eternal. The end of us. The end of everything I had believed, trusted, loved. And it would also be the beginning of my liberation. The clock seemed to make a deafening noise, ticking off each second as if it were the hammering of a sentence that she herself had signed. I watched her for long seconds, long enough to engrave in my memory the horror that appeared on her face, the despair in her eyes, the silent plea for a mercy that I could no longer give. Beside her, the man I had never seen before, dressed with the typical arrogance of someone who believes he had won, didn't even bother to pretend to be sorry. Smiled. He smiled as if he had won something valuable, without knowing that the prize he had just won was poisoned with the weight of betrayal. At that moment, every memory I had of her, every kiss, every laugh, every night I swore eternal love, turned to dust. It was as if I was watching a movie where the hero finally discovers that the villain has always been by his side, disguised as love. I left without making a fuss, without a single word. It was too late to scream. Too late to cry. Too late to ask for explanations. What was left for me was to move forward, even if each step seemed to tear me up inside. As I walked away from that grotesque scene, I remembered the times I trusted blindly. Of the lazy Sunday mornings when I made her coffee, thinking I was taking care of someone who would never betray me. Of planned trips, of plans for the future, of whispered conversations in the dark. Everything is a farce. A story where only I believed in, forever. I remembered the afternoons when she smiled at me in that sweet way and I, foolishly, thought that was the only reason for her happiness. I remembered the nights I held her while she slept and promised myself to protect her from the world, without imagining that, in the end, she would be the one to stab me in the back. Back at our house, the silence seemed to scream in my ears. I looked at the sofa where she had so often curled up in my arms and wondered how many times she had lain there, thinking about someone else. I touched the walls, the photos on the shelf, trying to understand how everything could fall apart so quickly. But the truth is that it wasn't fast. Betrayal is like a silent infiltration that rots everything from the inside before the first cracks appear. I just didn't want to see it. That night, I made the hardest decision of my life. I took my phone, blocked her number, deleted our photos, cleaned every trace of her from my contacts like removing a tumor. Did I cry? Yes. But they were tears of relief, not pain. Because, despite everything, I knew I deserved more. I deserved someone who would choose me every day, not just when it was convenient. Someone who saw in me a home, not a way station. The next day arrived heavy, like a cloudy sky about to collapse. I received messages from her, desperate calls, pathetic attempts to justify the unjustifiable. "It's not what it seems," she said. "I still love you," he insisted. As if love could be measured between sheets shared with another. As if words were enough to erase the image of her laughing at something he whispered in her ear, his hand touching hers in an intimate way, like I did. As if love resists betrayal without something fundamental being broken forever. And it was when I least expected it that life showed that justice can take a while, but it always arrives. Weeks later, she came to me. It was different. Swollen eyes, haggard face, an almost childish desperation in every gesture. She told me, between sobs, that her lover, the one for whom she had risked our marriage, had simply disappeared. He didn't answer any more calls, he disappeared from social media, he disappeared from her life like a ghost. Not just that. He had taken with him everything she thought she had achieved, money, jewelry, empty promises. Every illusion, every crumb of happiness she thought she found outside our home, turned to ashes in her hands. Watching his downfall didn't bring me the pleasure I expected. It brought only a bitter sense of poetic justice. She lost everything. And I, in a strange way, gained something I had long forgotten, my freedom. My right to start over without carrying the weight of disloyalty on my shoulders. My right to find someone who looked at me the way I deserved to be looked at, with truth. To this day I remember the last time I saw her. She was waiting for me in front of the building where I now lived, curled up inside herself, holding in her hands a letter that I had never read. I walked up to her, looked into her pleading eyes and realized that there, before me, was just the shadow of the woman I once loved. I gave him a slight nod, not of farewell, but of release, and continued on. Without looking back. Because some stories deserve to be left behind, buried in the past where they belong. But what she never knew. What no one would have ever imagined. Is that what led me to that restaurant on that fateful night was no coincidence. It wasn't an intuition. It was something much bigger, something that would change not just the fate of that night, but our entire history. Something that, to this day, few could explain. And that's why that night will never be just the end of a story of betrayal, but the beginning of a twist that no one saw coming. Welcome to the channel. Here, we do not support or romanticize betrayal in any form. All the stories you hear are fictional, created to show the harsh reality. Betrayal destroys lives, corrodes families and leaves deep marks on the heart. Get ready now to dive into an intense story, full of emotions, revelations and twists. Take a deep breath, because what you will hear today will shock you. Daniel and Laura were one of those couples who seem tailor-made for each other, those who draw admiring glances at family parties, those who make friends whisper about how true love still exists in this world. They met when they were young, in a chance encounter at a cafe in a busy park, when Daniel, with his calm manner and disarming smile, bumped into Laura, accidentally knocking over the book she was reading absent-mindedly. She, with her lively brown eyes and a shy smile, laughed when she saw the clumsy boy apologizing. What started as an apology turned into hours of conversation, exchanging dreams and childhood stories. Without them realizing it, the two were already connected by an invisible thread that seemed to promise that they would never lose each other again. Time solidified this connection. Daniel, a structural design engineer, was a dedicated man, someone who saw beauty in the small details of life, someone who valued stability, fidelity and routine. Laura, in turn, was a fine arts teacher, passionate about the nuances of colors, the stories behind the paintings, the smell of new canvases. She carried a free spirit in her chest, a constant desire to explore emotions and senses, but she found in Daniel the anchor she needed to not lose herself. They got married in a simple ceremony, but full of feelings, surrounded only by those who were truly part of their journey. The home they built together reflected this duality, Daniel's security and comfort intertwined with Laura's creativity and delicate charm. The walls were decorated with pictures painted by her, mixed with shelves organized by him, always meticulous. At night, they liked to sit on the porch, share cheap wine and laugh about stories of the day, about Laura's students, about Daniel's complicated projects. It was an ordinary life to those looking in from the outside, but to them, it was perfect. The routine, little by little, shaped their days, waking up together, preparing coffee, exchanging a quick kiss and heading to work. On Saturdays, the tradition of going to the local market remained firm, where they discussed which flowers to take home or which cheese to try. On Sundays, Laura always prepared pancakes, and Daniel, even without admitting it, had been waiting all week for that moment. For years, Daniel believed that nothing was out of place. He saw in Laura the woman he would grow old with, the one who would hold his hand when his strength failed, who would laugh at the wrinkles that appeared on his face with the same tenderness as when they were in their early 20s. He never doubted that she felt the same way. Laura, although she had a restless flame within her, always found in Daniel a calm that she considered essential. She loved him in a way that sometimes she couldn't even explain, like someone who loves a landscape for the sensation it brings, and not just for its beauty. With him, she felt safe, protected, loved. Their friends always said they were living proof that love could stand the test of time. At dinners and meetings, Laura stood out with her vibrant energy, infecting everyone around her with her light laugh and her funny stories about her messy students. Daniel, more reserved, enjoyed watching Laura shine, proud, silently grateful to have her by his side. When their eyes met, there was something there that seemed stronger than any words could express. A silent pact of loyalty and affection. But life, with its unpredictable nature, never completely settles down. The demands of work began to take a greater place in Daniel's life. New projects emerged, work trips became more frequent. He tried to make up for the time away by bringing small gifts, flowers, chocolates, affectionate notes hidden around the house. Laura smiled and thanked him, but deep down, a part of her missed him in a way that she couldn't always verbalize. He began to fill his time with new classes, workshops, art exhibitions. Her restless soul needed something more, something to fill the spaces that, without realizing it, were beginning to open up inside her. Still, in the moments they were together, it seemed like nothing had changed. Daniel hugged her with the same tenderness as always, and Laura responded with the same warmth. He talked about plans for the future, maybe buying a bigger house, maybe traveling more after his responsibilities lessened. She listened, smiled and agreed, but inside her, the feeling that something was slipping through her fingers grew silently. There were nights when Laura would lie awake, looking at the ceiling, listening to Daniel breathe next to her, and wondering if love was enough. If that comfort was enough for the flame she still felt she needed. There were afternoons when, in the middle of his classes, his thoughts were lost in silent reveries about what else life could offer. Not because of a lack of love for Daniel, but perhaps because of a lack of love for herself, for parts of herself that, somewhere along the way, she left aside to fit into the life they had built together. Daniel, on the other hand, was still oblivious to these concerns. For him, her every laugh, every touch, every plan, were clear signs that they were okay. He didn't see the signs, or maybe he chose not to. I preferred to believe that the love they shared was foolproof, immune to the wear and tear of time, armored against anything. He bet all his money on the solid construction they had made together, believing that it was enough to continue doing his part, being present, being trustworthy, being loving. Without realizing that, sometimes, what is missing is not love. It's a sense. And time, always relentless, continued its course. Small cracks began to open. Conversations that used to flow now sometimes turn into uncomfortable silences. Plans that once excited them now seemed like burdensome tasks. Small details that previously went unnoticed became the reason for long, suspended looks, as if there were questions unasked, answers never spoken. But everyday life was adept at hiding cracks. Daily tasks, social commitments, family obligations. Everything worked to cover up what was silently unraveling. In the midst of this, Laura began to explore her art more, exhibiting her work in new spaces, meeting new people, immersing herself in worlds that made her feel alive in ways she hadn't felt for a long time. She laughed more on those nights, she felt her blood pulse stronger, her heart beat faster. And, perhaps without realizing it, he began to build a part of himself away from Daniel's eyes. A space where she was just Laura, not Laura and Daniel. Where her wishes were not part of an us, but only hers. Daniel, noticing the subtle changes, tried to rekindle what he thought was cooling down. Surprises, weekend trips, dinners out. But, at many moments, it seemed like he was fighting an invisible current that was dragging him away from her. He saw the sparkle in Laura's eyes, but he didn't know how to reach it again. Still, he persisted, believing that it was just a phase, that everything would soon return to normal, that their love was too strong to succumb. And so they continued, each in their own world, each trying, in their own way, to keep alive something that was already beginning to transform without their being able to control it. The foundations were still there, the affection, the respect, the history built, but what sustains a castle can also crumble slowly, stone by stone, without hearing the sound of the fall until everything has collapsed. What Daniel didn't know, what Laura still didn't dare admit even to herself, was that the path they walked together was already beginning to fork. What new feelings, new choices, and new pains would arise to test how far their love could really go? There was still love, yes. But sometimes, love alone isn't enough. And it was like this, between gestures of affection that already carried the weight of routine, between smiles that tried to hide doubts and plans that no longer had the same firmness, that their story was preparing to change forever, in the most unexpected and devastating way possible. The following weeks were a real game of disguise for Laura. While the mornings continued to be populated by hurried coffees and routine kisses on the doorstep, and the nights still held quiet conversations under the porch lit by soft lights, there was an invisible layer of distance growing between her and Daniel, as silent as a fog that slowly swallows the landscape without anyone noticing. Laura threw herself into her projects with feverish enthusiasm, filling every empty space with new activities, artistic encounters, cultural events. Daniel, in turn, tried to keep up with this breakneck pace, still without realizing that he was chasing a version of her that seemed increasingly unreachable. There were moments when, sitting on the sofa in the living room, Daniel watched Laura walk through the rooms of the house, laughing on the phone, arranging her hair with a lightness that previously only appeared when they were alone, and something inside him would contract in a strange way. It wasn't jealousy, at least not the obvious kind, but an unsettling feeling that he had lost the map of the territory he once knew so well. Yet every time this feeling arose, he buried it beneath a layer of rationality. It was just the stress of work, he told himself, just the side effect of two busy lives trying to coexist. Their love was strong. Always gone. And, deep down, Daniel was proud of blindly trusting, as if this were a greater proof of love than any oath or promise. Laura, on the other hand, struggled daily with a whirlwind of emotions that she could barely name. It wasn't that she had stopped loving Daniel, but there was a part of her that screamed for something more, something that even she herself couldn't define. Maybe it was just the irrational search for a new emotion, maybe a yearning to feel alive in a way that routine had put to sleep. When she met Raphael, a classmate from a contemporary arts course that she had started attending on Thursdays, she didn't expect her life to take any detour. Raphael was kind, intelligent, interested in the same topics as her, with a look that always seemed to understand her before she even said anything. Initially, meetings between them were casual, always in groups, always under the cloak of polite formality. But over time, small gestures began to creep in. A lingering touch on the shoulder, an exchanged smile that lasted a second longer than it should have, gazes that met in silence while the world around them seemed to fade away. Laura resisted, or at least believed she was resisting. She made excuses for herself, saying it was just friendship, that she was just rediscovering her own joy in sharing interests with someone. It was harmless. He was innocent. Until it wasn't anymore. The day everything changed was a gray Friday afternoon, when Laura decided to stay late after an exhibition to help Raphael dismantle part of the works. The gallery slowly emptied, leaving a silence charged with electricity. Casual conversations gave way to whispered confessions, restrained laughter, inevitable closeness. When Raphael held his hand, there was no resistance. When their faces got closer, there was no retreat. The kiss happened with the inevitability of a tide invading the beach, washing away any notion of right or wrong. And, at that moment, Laura felt something she hadn't felt in a long time, vertigo, desire, the accelerated pulse of newness. After that day, nothing was the same. Meetings began to become part of Laura's clandestine routine. Small getaways disguised as cultural events, long lunches on weekdays, messages exchanged in secret. Every moment with Raphael was a dive into intense emotions, into sensations that made her feel young, alive, desired in a way she hadn't experienced in a long time. And, paradoxically, every return home was a stab of guilt that she tried to hide with smiles, with quick kisses, with automatic caresses. She hated herself in parts, but she justified her actions with flimsy arguments that barely convinced herself. "It's just a phase," he said. "It will pass. Soon I'll be back to who I was." Daniel, in turn, began to feel the disconnection more intensely. There were times when he caught himself looking at Laura and thinking he didn't know her anymore. Small absences, inconsistent excuses, distractions in the middle of important conversations. He tried to pull her back, tried to rekindle the flame, but it felt like he was talking to a reflection, not the real woman he once held so tightly in his arms. Sometimes, in the middle of the night, he would wake up with a bad feeling, a weight on his chest, but he would tell himself it was just tiredness. That Laura was just going through a rough patch. That their love would endure. But doubt, once planted, grows silent and voracious. In an attempt to reconnect, Daniel planned a special night. Without telling her, he organized a surprise dinner at a restaurant that had been the scene of so many happy moments at the beginning of their relationship. He reserved a discreet table, bought flowers, wrote a small passionate note that he intended to deliver with dessert. He spent the whole afternoon anxious, imagining her reaction, betting all his hopes on a night that could reverse what he felt slipping through his fingers. Laura, when she received the message saying to meet him at the restaurant, felt her stomach turn. She knew that Raphael wanted to see her that same night, that they had agreed on something informal, something that promised to be more than the rushed meetings of the last few days. Doubt gnawed at her. But, overcome by the guilt that followed her like a shadow, she decided that she would go to meet Daniel. Maybe there was still salvation. Maybe, if he tried hard, he would be able to reconnect the bonds before they were broken for good. She never got to Daniel. While he waited anxiously, checking his watch from time to time, Laura became lost in thought. In an impulse that not even she could explain, she sent a message to Raphael, asking where he was. He responded quickly, as he always did, with the address of a nearby bar. Without much thought, guided by a mixture of anxiety and desire, Laura took a different path. She thought about just seeing him for a few minutes, explaining that she needed to leave, that night was important for her and Daniel. But the reunion was like a magnet. One beer turned into two, which turned into an aimless walk, which turned into a stolen kiss on the dark sidewalk. What was supposed to be a quick goodbye turned into something that Laura knew, deep down, she could never erase. Daniel, after hours of waiting, with the flower wilting next to the plate and the note crumpled in his sweaty hands, decided to leave. Tried to call. No response. Tried to send a message. Visa. No response. A discomfort washed over him, a sharp discomfort that began as a whispered suspicion and quickly became a shrill scream in his mind. Against his will, he decided to stop by the bar where Laura used to meet coworkers. Just to make sure she was okay, he told himself, trying to camouflage the fear that had already taken over his chest. He didn't have to look far. From the opposite sidewalk, between the dim lighting and the parked cars, he saw what he had never wanted to see. Laura, holding hands with Raphael, head resting on his shoulder, laughing at something she would never know what it was. Time seemed to stop. The world, for a second, ceased its movement. Daniel stood still, as if the reality around him was slowly collapsing, and he had no strength to stop it. With ragged breaths, he watched as the two walked away, oblivious to his presence, as if they were part of a life he was never part of. There was no confrontation. There was no screaming. There was no scandal. The betrayal was revealed there, raw, silent and devastating, piercing Daniel with a pain that words could never express. But what he still didn't know, what was yet to be revealed, was that this betrayal was just the surface of the abyss that opened beneath his feet. Something much bigger, more cruel and unexpected, was about to be revealed. And this time, no hope would be able to save them. The silence of that night weighed on Daniel like a sheet of lead. He returned home as if carrying his own body on his back, with heavy steps and a trance-like mind. Every door he opened, every light he turned on, seemed to mock the life that, until hours ago, he believed was his. He sat on the couch and stared at the front door, waiting for her to come in like she did every night, with her bag slung over her shoulder and her hair tied up, asking about his day, offering a distracted kiss. But that night, she wouldn't come. That night, absence was a scream that echoed through the walls, ripping out pieces of what was left of your heart. When Laura finally showed up, almost at dawn, the expression on her face said everything Daniel needed to know. There were no more excuses, no more masks. She entered slowly, hesitantly, as if invading forbidden territory. The key turned slowly in the lock, as if trying to postpone the inevitable. Daniel didn't get up. Just watched. Her gaze, when she finally met his, was a mixture of guilt and despair. He saw her eyes shining, her breathing quick, her hands shaking trying to keep her bag without making a sound. As if there was still any chance of hiding what was already open. Laura opened her mouth to speak, but Daniel raised his hand, asking for silence. For long seconds, they remained there, trapped in unbearable tension. Until he asked, in a voice that didn't even sound like his own, so hoarse that it sounded more like a breath, "Why?" Laura took a deep breath, trying to find words to justify the unjustifiable. She said she felt alone, lost, suffocated by a routine that seemed to have swallowed everything she was. She said it wasn't his fault, that Daniel had always been perfect, that perhaps the mistake lay in her own inability to be content with the secure happiness he offered. Each word was a dull stab in his chest, but Daniel didn't interrupt. He let her finish, let her try to explain herself, even though she knew that nothing she said could rebuild what she had destroyed. When she finished, silence reigned again. Daniel felt the bitter taste of betrayal in his mouth, the heat of humiliation burning beneath his skin. There was no explosive anger in him, just an emptiness so deep it seemed capable of swallowing everything else. Without saying anything else, he got up and went to the bedroom. He picked up a suitcase and started throwing clothes inside without worrying about folding or separating. Laura followed him, crying softly, asking him not to leave, promising that it would be different, that she could change, that it was just a crisis, a mistake. Daniel stopped, turned to her, and for the first time that night, his gaze was cold, distant, like a stranger. "You destroyed everything. There is no fix for this." He left that night without looking back. He spent the first few days like a ghost, wandering from hotel to hotel, trying to understand where everything had gone. The world he knew had fallen apart, and he now walked among the rubble, trying to find some part of himself that hadn't been destroyed. The pain was constant, but there was also a strange feeling of freedom emerging, timidly, like the first light of morning after an endless night. What Daniel didn't know, what he had yet to discover, was that Laura was already beginning to reap the consequences of what she had sown. In the first days after the separation, she looked to Raphael for the comfort she could no longer find at home. She hoped, perhaps, that the passion that had driven her mad would fill the emptiness that now spread inside her like a plague. She looked for him anxiously, sent messages, tried to arrange meetings. But Raphael, so eager to win her over, now seemed evasive, cold, distant. Every attempt to contact was ignored, every call went to voicemail. When she finally managed to talk to him, the conversation was quick, dry and devastating. He was leaving. Transferred to another city, accepting a new project, starting a new life. Without her. Laura didn't believe it. He insisted, he begged for an explanation, for a reason. But Raphael just said, in a voice empty of any emotion, that it had never been more than a pastime, a temporary distraction, something that should have ended before it even started. He said she was amazing, of course, but that their lives were different, that he had no room for complications. He said he needed to move on and that she should do the same. And with that, he hung up. The ground disappeared beneath Laura's feet. The world was spinning and she had nowhere to hold on. Everything he had sacrificed, his marriage, his history, his peace, had been for nothing. She was left alone, more alone than she had ever felt, surrounded only by the bitterness of her own choices. Every memory, every touch, every laugh shared with Raphael was now a slow poison that consumed his strength. Tried calling again. Tried sending messages. But there was no return. It was as if he had never existed. Meanwhile, Daniel, despite carrying his own wounds, began to rediscover pieces of himself that he believed he had lost forever. He moved to a small apartment, started his routine again, rebuilding himself inch by inch, day after day. There was pain, of course. He still woke up in the middle of the night looking for a body that was no longer there, he still found himself remembering small gestures, details that now seemed irrelevant and cruel. But there was also relief. The feeling of being free from a lie, from a life that, although it seemed perfect, was built on quicksand. The reunion between them happened by chance, weeks later. Laura, with her eyes sunken and her face haggard, found Daniel leaving a coffee shop. He was different. Thinner, perhaps, but there was a serenity in his countenance that she could no longer remember seeing. He approached, calling his name in a choked voice. Daniel looked at her without surprise, as if he had already been waiting for that moment, as if this were just another inevitable page in their story. She tried to smile, but the smile died on her lips. He said he was sorry. She said she had made the worst mistake of her life. He said he wanted a chance to show he could change. Daniel listened to everything in silence, like someone watching the rain fall on the other side of the window, without wanting to get wet again. When Laura finished, he just said, in a quiet but firm voice, "I loved you in every way I knew how. And you chose to lose me. There's nothing left to save." She tried to justify herself, she spoke of loneliness, of confusion, of needs that she didn't know how to deal with. She confessed that Raphael had abandoned her, that she now saw how foolish she had been, that losing Daniel was like losing the ground. But Daniel just looked at her with serene sadness and replied, "I am not your floor. I never went. I was your choice. And you did another one." Without another word, he walked away, leaving Laura alone, holding the weight of her choices, feeling for the first time the true face of the loneliness she had feared so much. The love that could have been eternal fell apart there, not in explosions or screams, but in the bitter silence of two people who, at some point, forgot how to hold each other's hands in the middle of the storm. And so, between eyes that could no longer meet, ended the story of a love that seemed unbreakable, but that, in the end, succumbed to the invisible fissures that grew until nothing was left but emptiness. There was still a lot to be experienced. There were still new stories to be written. But that one was gone forever. Daniel continued on his way after that brief encounter, without looking back, like someone closing a heavy door and turning the key forever. The street seemed wider that morning, the air lighter, as if he had finally managed to free himself from a chain that had been holding him back without realizing it. He felt no pride, no pleasure in seeing her in that miserable condition, because the truth was that, in some remote corner of his chest, there was still a silent pang of grief for what they had been. But now it was different, it was a peaceful morning, which no longer called for reconciliation or revenge. Just acceptance. He needed to move on, he needed, in some way, to find himself again, to rebuild something inside himself that was true, that was his alone. Laura, in turn, saw the world around her crumble with a fury she could not control. She had lost her husband, she had lost her lover, she had even lost herself. He walked the streets like a shadow of his former self, not really knowing where to find shelter. The friends who had previously surrounded her now moved away with looks of reproach or pity, and loneliness was the punishment that echoed in each step. She tried to occupy herself by teaching, dedicating herself to the art that once filled her with life, but now every brushstroke was a cruel reminder of the emptiness she carried. Previously vibrant colors became dull, cold, soulless tones. The inspiration he sought had been stifled by regret, and there wasn't enough canvas in the world to contain so much guilt. Not knowing where else to run, Laura decided to look for Daniel one last time, in the desperate hope that there was a crack through which she could infiltrate his life again. Didn't send messages, didn't call. He just went, without warning, with his heart beating wildly, his hands sweaty with nervousness. He found him in the park where they used to walk on Sundays, where they laughed at trivial things and dreamed big, sitting on the wooden bench under the shade of the old trees. Daniel was there, alone, reading some book, looking at peace in a way that destroyed her just by looking at it. He approached slowly, feeling the ground tremble beneath his feet, as if each step was a risk that could make everything collapse even more. When he noticed her presence, he looked up without surprise, without joy, but also without anger. Just a serenity that Laura didn't recognize, an insurmountable distance that said more than any words could. She sat next to him, without asking permission, because she already knew that this was her last chance. His voice broke when he tried to start, but he forced himself to continue, because if he didn't say everything now, he would never have another chance. She said she missed him every day, that every morning without his smile was like waking up in a world without color. He said he knew that what they had built was rare, precious, and that he had destroyed it with his own hands. She spoke about fear, about the insecurity that made her seek out what she herself was unable to give herself. He admitted that Raphael was just an illusion, that nothing, absolutely nothing, was worth the loss of Daniel. He asked for forgiveness, but not as someone who expects to be forgiven, but as someone who knows that asking is the only consolation he has left. Daniel listened to everything in silence, his eyes fixed on her, as if observing an old painting that was once beautiful, but now bears irreparable cracks. When Laura finished, letting her tears flow freely, he closed the book, rested it on the bench next to him, and spoke calmly. He said he understood her pain, that he recognized the weight she carried, but that some wounds don't heal with just apologies. He said that their love had been real, and that perhaps that was why the betrayal had been so fatal. Some things, once broken, simply cannot be put back together. And that forgiving did not mean forgetting, nor did it mean allowing everything to go back to the way it was before. Laura tried to argue, she talked about starting over, about reconstruction, about the possibility of writing a new story. Daniel just smiled, a sad smile, and replied that they both deserve new stories, but not together. That sometimes, loving someone also meant letting them go. He then got up, took the book and left her sitting on the bench, alone, with the shade of the trees covering her silent tears. That was the last time they saw each other for a long time. Time passed, as it always passes, indifferent to human pain. Daniel immersed himself in work, rebuilt his social circle, met old friends, and met himself again. Little by little, he allowed himself to smile again, he allowed himself to believe that he could love again, in a new way, without the scars of the past defining each step. He met Anna on a random afternoon, in a small bookstore hidden among the busy streets of the center. She was different from Laura in almost every way, discreet, soft-spoken, with eyes that seemed to see beyond words. The connection between them was not explosive, it was not a fire that consumes, but rather a slow ember, which heats up little by little, which does not hurt. Anna knew about the broken pieces inside Daniel and didn't try to put them back together in a hurry. He just sat down next to him, held his hand firmly and waited for him to find the right moment to rebuild himself. It was different, it was more mature, it was real. Daniel learned that true love does not require rushing or desperate tests. It happens in the rhythm of small things, a shared laugh at the end of a difficult day, a comfortable silence that doesn't need to be filled, a look that says I'm here even when words fail. Laura, on the other hand, struggled to find herself again. He tried to rebuild his life in some way, but the scars of the betrayal he had committed were difficult to erase. Old friends were now just distant faces. The career he loved so much had become a silent battleground between inspiration and guilt. Each new relationship was sabotaged by silent comparisons, by a constant fear of repeating the same mistakes. And deep down, I knew I would never find someone like Daniel again, because men like him aren't common, they don't come around twice in a lifetime. Years later, their paths crossed again by chance at an art fair. Laura exhibited her paintings, works that, over time, gained more vivid colors, although full of melancholy. Daniel was passing by the place with Anna, who was laughing at something he had said. Laura saw them from afar and, for a moment, the world stopped again. She observed the genuine smile on his face, the way he held Anna's hand, the way he looked at her with that serenity that had once been hers. And he understood, once and for all, that it was no longer his. That it would never be again. There was no approach, no exchange of words. Just glances that met for a second, quick, full of everything that could no longer be said. Laura smiled, a sad and sincere smile, finally accepting the place she now occupied in Daniel's story, the past. And, with a heavy heart, but strangely at peace, he turned and went his way, knowing that, somehow, they had both found their place in the world, even if it wasn't side by side. Daniel, in turn, followed hand in hand with Anna, without knowing that he had been seen, without imagining that, in that silent moment, a definitive chapter of his life was closing. Deep down, maybe I knew. Maybe, deep down, I felt like the story that started with love and ended with betrayal was now finally resting in peace. And this time, there was no more pain. There was only freedom. After that brief meeting of eyes at the art fair, life continued its course as if that had been just an echo of a past that could no longer hurt. Daniel and Anna continued walking among the colorful stalls, laughing at small details, tasting new flavors, living that moment as if the whole world fit in the simplicity of a shared gesture. There was no comment on who they had seen, no need to revisit old wounds. For Daniel, that brief encounter only served as a silent confirmation that he had chosen the right path, that he no longer carried the weight of old ghosts. But for Laura, the impact was different. As she turned her back and blended into the crowd, she felt the weight of the choices she had made crushing her in a different, more resigned way. It was no longer burning pain or revolt. It was the melancholic acceptance that life does not offer multiple chances for certain mistakes. Some doors, once closed, do not open again. In the days that followed, Laura immersed herself in her art, trying to transform sadness into expression. The canvases began to take on more vivid tones, mixed with intense lines that bore the mark of those who know loss up close. His exhibitions began to attract attentive attention. Critics praised the emotional depth of his works, as if they could feel, without even knowing it, the story of a heart shattered and rebuilt by pain. Despite the growing recognition, the feeling of emptiness persisted, like a cold breeze that passes through the cracks of a beautiful house, but abandoned inside. She knew that professional success did not fill the emotional gaps she had opened with her own hands. She knew that the nights would continue to be long and silent, that applause would never replace the hug of someone who truly loved her. Daniel, on the other hand, had not only found a new love in Anna, but also a new purpose. They began to build something together calmly and respectfully, without the rush or desperate desire to prove anything to the world. Every gesture between them was genuine, every word carried a care that was born from the mutual recognition of their scars. He knew that Anna was not there to fill Laura's space, but to build something completely new alongside him, something that was born clean, free from the mistakes of the past. Life now seemed to have a different rhythm, slower, more conscious. And for the first time in a long time, Daniel felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. However, not everything was as simple as it seemed. There was still a silent dilemma inside him, a part that, even though he had moved on, struggled with the issue of forgiveness. Not the forgiveness that would allow Laura to return to his life, as he knew that would never happen, but the internal forgiveness, the one that frees completely, that prevents bitterness from taking root and contaminating what could still be pure and true. For many nights, while Anna slept peacefully by his side, Daniel lay awake, looking at the ceiling, wondering if he would be able to forgive fully, of not carrying the shadows of what he had suffered into the future. He knew that to forgive was not to forget, nor to minimize pain, but to accept that the past should no longer have power over his present. Anna, sensitive as she was, noticed these silent battles. He didn't demand, he didn't pressure, he was just there, offering his presence as a safe haven. It was on one of those sleepless dawns that Daniel, upon feeling her warmth at his side, understood that true liberation would not come with punishing those who hurt him, but rather with the act of letting go, of definitively letting go of that weight. The next morning, he made a decision that would seal his new journey once and for all. He would write a letter to Laura, not to get back together, nor to rekindle any bond, but to finally say, in words, that he forgave her, that he freed them both from that invisible link that tied them to the past. She sat at the table in the small room lit by the soft light of dawn and wrote with a steady hand, letting the words come out without bitterness, without resentment. He wrote that he truly loved her, that what they experienced was real and beautiful while it lasted, but that it was time for everyone to follow their path without carrying the chains of guilt. She said that she understood that human beings are flawed, that everyone is looking for something that sometimes they don't even know how to name, and that, although she had made a mistake, she also had the right to redemption, even if it wasn't by his side. He ended by wishing her to find the peace she sought and signed his name, not as an ex-husband, but as someone he once loved deeply and now knew how to let go. Laura received the letter on a rainy afternoon, while organizing her materials for a new exhibition. He recognized the handwriting before he even opened the envelope, and his heart skipped a beat. As you read each line, hot tears silently ran down your face. It wasn't a reconciliation letter, and she hadn't expected it to be. It was a letter of liberation, and on some level, it was exactly what she needed to accept that her story with Daniel was over, but that it didn't condemn her to a life of eternal punishment. It was a silent invitation to forgive herself, to move forward, even if the road was long and uncertain. At that moment, Laura understood that life, with all its brutality and beauty, does not wait for those who hesitate. Every choice has a price, and she paid hers, not with hatred or self-pity, but with the silent courage to start over. She kept the letter inside an old book, where she could find it when she needed to remember that one day she was truly loved and that, despite everything, she still deserved to find her own happiness, in a new, more mature, perhaps more solitary, but also truer way. Meanwhile, Daniel and Anna continued to weave their story together. They began to make plans for the future, not grandiose, not hasty, but plans made up of small dreams, a trip for two to an unknown place, a project to redecorate the apartment, the idea of adopting a dog. Small gestures, small steps, which, together, formed something solid and full of meaning. Daniel felt that, finally, he had found what he had been searching for so long, not perfection, not unbridled passion, but the peace of sharing life with someone who understood that love is, above all, a daily choice, silent commitment, constant generosity. The history between Daniel and Laura was not erased, it never would be. Real, intense stories don't go away. They transform, settle in corners of memory where they no longer cause pain, just longing for who we were, gratitude for what we learned. And perhaps that was the greatest lesson of all, that some losses do not come to destroy us, but to make room for something better, truer, more compatible with who we have become. In the end, Daniel found redemption not in Laura's punishment, but in accepting his own ability to move on. Laura found strength not in reclaiming what she lost, but in building a new identity, one that bore its scars like silent medals. And so, on paths that would never truly cross again, they followed, each carrying the story they wrote together, but also the blank pages of new beginnings that were yet to come. Fate, capricious as it is, was already preparing to take its last turn. One last lesson, one last test, before each one could finally find true freedom. And when the inevitable arrived, there would be no more unnecessary tears, no more broken promises. Just the certainty that, despite everything, life, always life, knows exactly how to lead us back home. Autumn advanced with its gentle breeze, scattering golden leaves across the sidewalks and bringing with it a serene melancholy, as if nature itself was resigning itself to the passage of time. Daniel and Anna walked together along a small trail covered in dry leaves, their steps slow, rhythmic, as they discussed simple things, books, travel, postponed dreams that now seemed possible. There was no rush in his words, no urgency in his gestures. The lightness between them was built on a solid foundation of respect, admiration and, above all, choice. Unlike anything Daniel had ever experienced before, that love was nourished by comfortable silence, complicit looks, an intimacy that didn't require grandiose declarations. Anna was the new chapter he didn't even know he needed to write, and, alongside her, he relearned the value of simplicity. Still, on very silent nights, when the city slept and the world seemed suspended in time, Daniel found himself reflecting on everything he had experienced. Not with longing or regret, but with a mature curiosity about how choices shape not only our paths, but also who we become. It was impossible to ignore the impact Laura had on his story, and, in a way, he knew it would be unfair to erase that part of himself. The pain he carried, the disappointments he faced, the lessons he learned by force, all of this had shaped the man he was now. There was no way I could love Anna in the deep and complete way I did if I hadn't gone through the storm that Laura represented. Life, with its silent irony, had turned his wounds into bridges. Meanwhile, Laura continued to fight her own internal battles. Even though she had received Daniel's letter, even though she understood and accepted that the story between them had ended, there was a part of her that still struggled to reconcile with who she had become. Working on art was his escape valve, but also a cruel mirror. Each finished painting seemed to ask if she had really managed to forgive herself. The admiring glances of visitors at his exhibits were a blessing and a burden at the same time. She knew that she conveyed emotion in her works, she knew that her pain was recognized and applauded, but deep down, she wished that those applauses were for what she was able to overcome, and not just for what she suffered. On a particularly cold night, while finishing the last details of a new exhibition, Laura received an unexpected visitor. It was Elisa, an old friend who had discreetly moved away after Daniel's divorce. There were no warm hugs or exaggerated greetings, just a shy wave and a discreet smile. Laura, still surprised, invited her in. They talked about pleasantries at first, but soon the atmosphere became charged with something more serious, more dense. Elisa didn't just come to satisfy her longing. He had brought words that Laura needed to hear, even if they hurt. She said that she had held feelings for a long time, that she also felt betrayed, because she believed in the love that Laura and Daniel represented. He said that, seeing Laura now, he realized that the cruelest punishment was not separation, nor loneliness, but the burden Laura carried. And that, in some way, he admired the silent strength she showed in moving forward. It was an uncomfortable, intense, but necessary dialogue. Because, for the first time in a long time, Laura didn't defend herself, she didn't justify herself. He just listened, absorbing every word like someone who knows that facing one's own shadow is the only path to true freedom. After that conversation, Laura spent days reflecting on the true nature of forgiveness. Forgiving herself was an arduous task, full of pitfalls. Sometimes I felt like I had taken 3 steps forward and then taken 4 steps back. In others, I noticed small progress, glimmers of hope in the simplest details, the pleasure of seeing a child admiring their paintings, the feeling of peace when finishing a work without tears in their eyes, the sincere smile when greeting strangers on the street. Life offered no guarantees, but it began to draw new paths, and she, even though she was afraid, began to take the risk of following them. Meanwhile, Daniel and Anna were considering the idea of moving to another city. Not out of escape, not out of necessity, but out of a genuine desire to start over in a new setting, where every street, every cafe, every park, was a territory to be explored together. They chose a small coastal town, where time seemed to pass more slowly, where they could build new memories without the weight of what was left behind. The decision was made on a lazy Sunday afternoon, sitting on the porch at home, with the smell of fresh coffee in the air and the soft sound of old vinyl playing in the background. There were no big speeches, just looks and a silent understanding that it was time to move on to the next chapter. Before moving, Daniel felt the need to visit some places that, in some way, had marked his history. Not to relive pain, but to close cycles. He passed the old house where he lived with Laura, now occupied by other faces, other lives. He walked through the park where so many conversations were shared, where laughter and tears mixed without ceremony. And finally, he passed by the bookstore where he met Anna, feeling a silent gratitude for the way life, even after so much suffering, was able to surprise him with something so beautiful. It was on one of these walks that, by chance or fate, he met Laura again. She was sitting alone on a bench near the park's fountain, with a sketchbook on her lap and her loose hair blowing in the wind. There was a different serenity about her, less bitter, more resigned. Daniel hesitated for a moment, considering whether or not he should approach. But something inside him said yes, that maybe that was the last piece of the puzzle that needed to be put in place. He approached slowly, respecting her space. Laura looked up and smiled, a small, sincere, unpretentious smile. There was no need for formal words, justifications, or excuses. They talked like old acquaintances who respect the history they shared, but who no longer carry its weight. They talked about life, about art, about new beginnings. Laura talked about the new exhibition she was planning, about the trip she would take to exhibit in another city, maybe even outside the country. Daniel talked about the change, about how the beach had always been a dream postponed that now seemed possible. At one point, Laura stopped, looked at him with a soft expression and said that, despite everything, she hoped he was immensely happy. It was not a hidden apology, nor an attempt at reconciliation. It was just a genuine desire of someone who finally understood that loving someone can also mean letting them go free. Daniel, his eyes shining slightly, replied that he wanted the same for her. And at that moment, without tears, without open pain, something definitively closed between them. After that day, they never saw each other again. Each one followed their path, carrying the marks of the story they wrote together, but without letting these marks define who they were from then on. Laura embarked on her trip abroad, finding art and new experiences a new reason to smile. Daniel and Anna moved to the coastal city, where the sound of the waves mixed with the light laughter of new beginnings, where love built with patience and respect blossomed every day. Life, with all its unpredictability, taught them both that there is no happy ending in the classic sense, but rather paths of peace built on acceptance, forgiveness, and the courage to move forward. And in the end, perhaps that is the true victory, living without regrets, with the serenity of someone who has learned that even the most painful falls can take us to the most unexpectedly beautiful places. The sound of the waves hitting the rocks made the end of that afternoon almost cinematic. Daniel and Anna, sitting on the still hot sand, watched the sun slowly sink below the horizon, dyeing the sky in golden and orange tones. The gentle wind carried the salty smell of the sea mixed with her discreet perfume, and Daniel felt that, for the first time in a long time, there was nothing he wanted to change at that moment. There were no longer invisible weights, nor ghosts from the past haunting his mind. The love he built with Anna was solid because it was born from maturity, from the acceptance that true love is not made of grandiose promises, but of daily choices, of small gestures that build an entire life. He looked at her and found a look that didn't demand, it was just there, firm, present, complete. He smiled sincerely and knew, without the need for words, that he was exactly where he was supposed to be. The wounds Laura had left had healed, not as scars of war, but as silent reminders of who he had been and who he had chosen to be. Meanwhile, Laura's life took a very different course. The trip abroad had been a courageous impulse, a desperate attempt to reinvent himself amid unfamiliar lands and faces that did not know their mistakes. Initially, the news brought a dormant euphoria, as if each new street and each different gallery were capable of erasing what it had left behind. But the truth is that distance does not erase guilt, nor does it transform wounds into victories. With every applause, with every admiring look she received at her exhibitions, Laura felt a bitter pang of emptiness. She knew that the recognition she now achieved was the result of the pain she herself cultivated, that her art was beautiful precisely because it overflowed with suffering and regret. On lonely nights, in front of open windows overlooking strange cities, she wondered if, somewhere in the timeline, there was still a version of herself capable of living simple happiness, without always seeking something more, without destroying what was good. As the months went by, Laura dedicated herself intensely to her work, participating in important events, being invited to prestigious exhibitions, but everything she achieved seemed to come with a shadow. The feeling of incompleteness grew as the success grew, and the irony of it slowly ate away at her. In a world where everything seemed about to be celebrated, she felt more and more like a fraud, like someone who had lost the most precious parts of herself in her eagerness to find something she never knew how to name. On a cold winter night, as she closed another exhibition with applause and camera flashes, Laura walked alone through the narrow streets of a city she didn't know, carrying the silent trophy of her empty achievements. And there, under the starry and indifferent sky, she understood that the true punishment for the betrayal she committed was not losing Daniel, but losing herself in the process. While Laura faced the ghosts she herself had created, Daniel moved forward in his new life with firm steps. He and Anna decided to adopt a dog, a playful-looking puppy who brought even more light to the house they now called home. Small traditions began to emerge among them: candlelit dinners on Friday nights, lazy walks on Sundays, last-minute trips to unknown destinations. Every moment shared was a silent reaffirmation that love can rise from the ashes, stronger, more beautiful, more true. Daniel felt that, with Anna, he had built something that had not only rescued him from the darkness, but had transformed him into someone better. She had taught him to trust again, to open up without fear, to understand that love is not the absence of flaws, but rather the choice to remain despite knowing every scar. Time, master of all answers, passed, bringing silent but profound changes. Laura, after years dedicated to art and self-forgiveness, decided to open a small art school for vulnerable children. He wanted, in some way, to leave a legacy that was greater than his own mistakes. He taught with patience and passion, and, in the children's laughter, he found fragments of peace that he thought he had lost forever. He never again became involved in great passions, he never again sought in intensity what he now knew he could only find in serenity. He accepted loneliness as part of his journey, not as a punishment, but as a conscious choice to live authentically, without illusions. Daniel, in turn, built a life full of new beginnings. He married Anna in an intimate ceremony by the sea, surrounded only by close friends and sincere smiles. There were no grand oaths, just silent promises made in glances and touches of hands. There, under the open sky and the sound of waves gently crashing, Daniel realized that everything he had experienced, every tear, every pain, every goodbye, had prepared him for that moment of silent fulfillment. Anna wasn't a consolation prize, she wasn't a replacement, she was the answer he didn't even know he was looking for. Years later, when revisiting the place where they got married, now holding hands with a small boy running in front of them, the result of a peaceful and generous love, Daniel felt gratitude invade his chest like a warm wave. Life, with all its unpredictability and cruelty, had taught him that even the most broken hearts can be reborn, that the greatest losses, if well understood, can become the foundations of our greatest victories. And so, each character found their place in the world. Laura, in the smiles of the children she helped grow. Daniel, in the family he built with wisdom and love. Anna, in the heart that she helped to heal and make flourish. All, in some way, carrying with them the memory of what was, but no longer prisoners of it. Because true redemption is not in erasing the past, but in using it as a springboard for a more worthy, more conscious future, more full of genuine love. Now, we want to know, what did you think of this story? Leave your opinion in the comments, tell us which part moved you the most, what lesson you take from this intense journey of love, loss, redemption, and new beginnings. Your opinion is very important to us. And don't forget, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any exciting stories like this. Here, we commit to real narratives, which show the consequences of our actions and the lessons that life imposes. And we remember once again, this channel does not support any form of betrayal. We believe in truth, respect and love built on honest choices. Thank you very much for following us this far. See you in the next story.